Hey, warmer from the low. Welcome to lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peterson, now part of the Beast Family Podcast. We've got a great podcast for you. We're going to be joined in segment number 2 here in a few minutes, and we're going to have a shorter segment number 1 with Tristan Freeman, who does such an amazing job over at Bustin' Brackets. We're going to be chatting with him about how we gauge these teams that are making their announcements a little bit late in terms of their transfer haul and what is all going into it as well, because some of these guys, you have to imagine, have been on campus for quite a while. Some of these guys, you have to imagine, they were actual late game calls in terms of being able to get them onto the roster as well. So we're going to be parsing through that. We're also going to be parsing through the landscape of the Sunbelt, why there's going to be a lot of upside with those teams, and my Sunbelt Conference preview, that is going to be up within the next about 48 or so hours, so that is something that is on tap. And coupled with that, we're going to be chatting about what we've got in terms of these coaches that they take a new role and then they bring with them quite a few of their players from another side, or sometimes it's one or two players, like we're going to be finding that with James Madison, a team that we're going to be talking about with our good friend Tristan. So we've got a lot of fun coming up there, and if you do have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you for this podcast, you have one of two ways we have fire those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at Gina_D1. Keep in mind, LarsEM, name does not matter, so as per usual, please do send these into the timeline, and the other way is find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated, and then from there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review, and I do encourage you guys to send those in, because that way I know exactly what you want to hear on this podcast. We are in a little bit of a holding pattern because we have not been seeing a lot of college basketball news, and it sort of comes in waves, like we saw with Bethune-Cookman a few days ago, where they announced like 5 different transfers, and that was very tremendous. And I think that we're going to be seeing that out of a few more of these MEAC and these SWAC schools. Anyone that is out there that is currently on the market, like a Kalen Boone, for example, you have to imagine that someone like a Keelan Boone, who's right now out there in the transfer portal, he's trying to determine whether or not he's going to be eligible for the season. And that's something else that we're going to be talking about with Tristan, because last season it was very clear cut as to who was not going to be eligible for the upcoming season. We sort of knew that it was like, okay, these 2-time transfers are probably not going to be able to hit the floor right away, and then we saw a hodgepodge of different guys become eligible right away, so that made things frivolous and very, very strange, to say the least, and that made things very hard to handicap as well. But this year, it's very much more all over the place, and we're going to be talking a little bit about that with Tristan as well. What guys might need a little bit of a last-second waiver to be able to play this season, and just how do we gauge that, and we're going to be chatting about just a wide variety of things with Tristan on the flip side here on Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peterson, now a part of the Beast Family Podcast. And we're back here in lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peterson, now part of the Beast Family Podcast. It's always great to be joined by this man. It's Tristan Freeman. He does such incredible work over at Bustin' Brackets, looking at this great game of college basketball that we all know and love. I know that he's been doing a lot of lists here in the offseason, as now we've got a lot of these rosters fortified, though we'll be talking about that a little bit, and I know that he's hard at work getting set for what is going to be an amazing college basketball season. To be able to follow my Twitter/X, that's at Hoopsnut351 all together. And Tristan, it's always a pleasure, my friend. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Greg. Appreciate it.
I appreciate you, Tristan, and I led into it because most of these schools, we know what they're getting, but when it comes to some of these smaller schools, like out there in the MEAC, the SWAC, the Atlantic Sun, you've got a few teams that are announcing their transfer hauls late, like we saw with Bethune-Cookman. They actually got a really nice transfer haul that's headlined by likes of Brayon Freeman, Antoine Jones and company. But what do you make out of these teams that we didn't know much about what they were getting and now are rolling it out there very, very quickly, as it makes me wonder when these guys actually committed to them, because I have to think that it wasn't just in the last 48 to 72 hours.
I'm not even sure if the word committed's right as much as they were approved eligibility-wise, because a lot of these guys, especially in the portal era, have extra years that were in question, in part because, in the case of Brayon Freeman, he was dismissed from Rhode Island early on, so you don't know if that counted for against his eligibility. I wasn't even aware that he was eligible. And I think for a lot of these guys who were looking at different stops, they weren't really getting recruited because their status was unknown. I think a good example of that is Kevin Easley, who recently got approved for an extra year as well, but he's still technically a free agent. So it'll be interesting to see where he lands. And a guy like Ontario Morris, who reportedly is being linked to Memphis, and everyone knows the former 5 stars troubles off the court. But yeah, I think a lot of these guys they're not necessarily guaranteed to be on teams. And I think that's a quiet storyline to watch. Like how many of these guys either have to get suspended for a few games the end of the year or whose eligibility is still in question. And we may not even know about that until, Rothstein or Goodman or others sort of say, hey, this guy's technically not even cleared to play, even though he's admitted and is on the roster.
Yeah, but how much more difficult is it going to be this offseason? Because last offseason, it was a case where these two-time transfers that weren't graduate transfers, we knew that those were the guys in question, and it was just a hodgepodge as to the guys when they were able to get out there on the court and when waivers were approved and when they were not. And that was one where you knew the guys that were in question. You had no idea when they were going to hit the court. This year, I feel like we don't have really any sort of an idea as to whose waivers may or may not even need to get approved and which ones are in question.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of European guys coming over who may or may not have been pros previously, and that's in question. I believe that another Avicii's brother, the Illinois commit, his status is still technically in question. Even though these might not be the usual transfer stuff, there are other issues that are affecting these guys, whether it's academics, pro status, and whatnot. And we know historically the NCAA has been very slow to get these guys approved. And if that remains the case, then we might have to wait until October to know some of these guys. And that's going to be an issue for coaches because with so many different rosters, knowing what players' roles and what their part of rotation is going to be is already a question. That's just going to be even harder. And that's definitely going to cause some of these teams to get out to slow starts and others to, not really know what their identity is until January.
Yep, and that's going to be one of the hardest parts here in the offseason as well because it feels a little bit more, shall we say, questionable as to what guys we're going to need to review their eligibility on this offseason rather than last offseason. As Tristan Freeman, who does such tremendous work over at Boston Brackets, he's joining me right here on Coast to Coast Hoops. And something else that we have seen over the last few days, a bit of a blow for Gonzaga. They're going to be without Steel Venters for the second straight year. Just absolutely devastating for them. But how do you take a look at a Gonzaga unit that I feel like if there is a team that's going to be able to survive a blow like this, it is them because they did a nice job adding guys like K-Leaf Battle and company in the backcourt. And while it does hurt, I still feel like they've got plenty of depth with regards to the guys that are coming back from a season ago as well.
Yeah, I think in the case of Gonzaga, Mark Few sort of learned his lesson from not having as much depth a year ago. They technically had depth, but the back of the bench was filled with European players who just weren't ready to go. And similar to UCLA. This time around, you mentioned Battle. Obviously, Dusty Stromer coming back. And it's interesting because assuming Venters was going to be in the rotation, he was someone whose minutes could have been in question, but he's obviously going to get to play. And then one guy who doesn't get talked about much is Emmanuel Innocenti, who was a freshman transfer from Tarleton State. He's a 6'5", one of those all-around type of guys that can rebound and pass, and he was an all-league defender. He's sort of he's 6'5", versatile wing forward, and he was someone that could have been a redshirt candidate because I think where his place in rotation was definitely going to be a question with all the seniors. Now that's not really going to be much of an issue at all. They can easily find him 10, 15 minutes on the wing, and that's going to be important for his development. And the team's going to need a lockdown defender. That's something that they're really going to miss without Anton Watson around. I don't know if they have that elite individual defender on the roster. In a sense, he has a chance to be that guy. And if that's the case, that's only going to make things better for Gonzaga, that they can put out various lineups to give them the edge.
And I think that leads into an interesting question as well, because they also brought in Braden Smith from Colgate, and they're one of the few teams that are doing this. They were playing the redshirt Braden Smith. Do you think that there's a chance that now he has to play right away, or do you think that they'll hold steady to their playing all along?
Yes, if Innocenti isn't ready to play, then you're going to have Battle get most of the minutes at the 3 spot. They could play, Michael Ajayi, the Pepperdine transfer, at the 3 if they wanted to. I think if you're Braden Smith, I think they're trying to have him mentally ready to sit out. I don't know if they're willing to throw him in because even with the injury to Venters, it doesn't change the fact that Nembhard's going to get 30-plus minutes as the point guard. And that Nolan Hickman could be easily the backup that can get the other 10 minutes. So if you're Braden Smith, do you want that role, even if it's for a Final Four contender, or you just sit out knowing that you're going to be the lead guard a year from now because those guys are all going to be gone.
Yep, I think that is going to be an interesting question to be asked. And for Gonzaga, that Venter's injury does hurt, but they're one team that is able to absorb it, and I think that they will be just fine moving forward. As joining me on the show, we do have Tristan Freeman, who does such great work over at Boston Brackets. He's joining me right here on Coast to Coast Hoops, and I do think that it's such an interesting offseason in that we have seen so much movement. Now, other than some of these smaller schools like we were alluding to, like a Bethune-Cookman, we know a lot of these rosters, but as you've been diving in this offseason, have there been a few teams that you've been a little bit more impressed by as you've been doing your research?
It's an interesting question because, I mean, you could argue you could be impressed with any of them because all of them with transfers are all going to have impact. It's really just a guessing game. Obviously, if you mentioned Bethune-Cookman, after losing Zion Harmon, who was a unique get for them in the past, they have, guys that are more than capable of competing down at the MEAC themselves. But I think just in all, I try not necessarily care, but think that there's going to be certain classes that are going to be much better than the others because there's going to be breakout JUCO transfers. And now with the flock of international guys, there could be players that you've never even heard of that have a big impact. I will say, if you look at the Sun Belt, despite losing a ton of talent, I think you're going to see teams like James Madison and Appalachian State not take too much of a step back because a lot of them brought in some really good classes. A lot of them are upper power conference guys that are looking for bigger roles but clearly have the talent. If I wanted to look at a whole conference, look for the Sun Belt to not take much of a step back because you could argue that they were a top 10 league a year ago with some of their top teams. And I think there's going to be plenty of depth for them once again.
Oh, and I am so glad that you mentioned the Sun Belt because within the next 48 hours, I'm actually doing my Sun Belt preview. And how do you feel about some of these teams like in Arkansas State that they're going to be bringing back quite a bit? Meanwhile, you've got a lot of coaching changes here in the conference. Coastal Carolina is undergoing one of them. Technically, Old Dominion is as well. It was a very interesting situation for them. You mentioned James Madison, but I take a look at this conference and you've got sort of like different strokes for different folks with a lot of slower tempo teams, a lot of up-tempo teams, and then a team in Southern Miss that they've got Andre Curbelo, who's going to be in season number 2, that I feel like could be a game changer, even though I know that he could be a little bit, shall we say, Jekyll and Hyde.
Yeah, and that doesn't even count teams like Marshall, who have historically been good, or South Alabama and Georgia State too, that could be primed to have bounce back years. A lot of talent. I wouldn't be surprised if there's like 5 or 6 teams that could win the conference. It's genuinely that deep. They've done a good job when it comes to landing talent collectively. I just kind of look back at James Madison and seeing the fact that they got, proven potential. And then don't forget, Mark Freeman, who's a guy who missed all of last year. He's a conference player of the year guy. If he's fully healthy, there's no reason why he can't come in and be a potential conference player of the year candidate for them as well. So I think anything can happen, and a lot of these rosters new. We'll have to see how the depth fits out, but I don't think that we're going to see too much of a drop-off from James Madison, despite losing all of their key players.
And I'm so glad that you mentioned James Madison as well, because how much do you look at these teams that have a first-year head coach like Preston Spradlin is going to be at James Madison, and they bring over some of their guys, like with St. Louis. I think that there's such a great example with Josh Schertz, bringing in Robbie Avila, bringing in Isaiah Swope. Those are teams I feel a lot more bullish on, rather than these teams that they just don't have quite as much of that chemistry with a first-year coach.
But there are also going to be some cases where talent just wins out no matter what. I mean, you look at what happened in Green Bay, going from one of the worst teams in the country and then improving greatly under Sundance Wicks, thanks in part to getting guys like Noah Reynolds, who was a transfer who probably didn't have to come down from Wyoming, but then ended up averaging 20 points a game and has them as a contender. Ultimately, there are great coaches that struggle out the gate because they don't have star players, and then there are coaches who may not necessarily be great in the long haul, but have excellent starting points because they have the one guy that can just simply take over. And in the college game, that's all you need.
Yep, and certainly we saw some teams be able to rise up in the Sun Belt towards the back half of the season as well. I'm very interested to see what Georgia State is going to be able to do this season. Texas State was a team that was able to improve as well. And then I never count on Appalachian State, to your point, because Dustin Kearns saw what he did at Presbyterian. Getting them to 20 wins is like getting a power conference team to like an Elite Eight Final Four for Sanders there. So there's going to be a lot of fun out there. And there's always a lot of fun when we chat with you, Tristan, because you're such a great mind when it comes to taking a look at this great sport of college basketball. You're getting set for what is going to be such a great year in this game with lots of moving parts. There's probably going to be lots of things that we didn't expect that are going to be happening, and you're doing your best to prepare for it all. So let the good people at home know it's all on tap for you and how people can follow along on social media and other platforms.
Yeah, you can follow me at hoopsnut351, and then also follow site I editor Bustin' Brackets for all college basketball stuff. And we're now fully in a preview mode, and there's a lot of things to cover and a lot of new faces, and it's still taking time to research, but it's going to be a fun couple of months before our season gets going.
Oh, it is going to be a lot of fun to take a look at, and sometimes that's the fun of it all. Sometimes we are absolutely right with regards to our preseason evaluation. Sometimes it's a big giant whiff, and when it comes to Mind Spear, if you're able to hit at north of 52.4%, you're doing pretty darn good. And a man that we hit on a great interview 100% of the time with, that'd be Tristan Freeman. Always great to get him aboard. So big thanks to Tristan for joining me on Coast to Coast Hoops, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. And if you do like hearing from this fine podcast, Coast to Coast Hoops, you're able to subscribe wherever your podcast, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn. If you do have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you for this podcast, you have one of two ways we able to fire those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at Jaden_D1. Keep in mind, letters CM, they mean does not matter. So as per usual, please do send these into the timeline, and I do encourage you guys to do so. That way I know what you want to hear on this podcast. So please do me a solid, fire in those Twitter/X questions, and the other way is find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated. From there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review, and I'm with you guys on this podcast all 366 days this calendar year, regular season and off season, rain or shine. I'm going to be with you guys. Got to get set for what I hope to be the most profitable college basketball season ever. So I appreciate you tuning in today, and I'll be back with you once again tomorrow. Thank you.